Shelter in the day of trouble, day 27. Good morning, saints. It's good to be with you this morning. This morning is going to be part one of, I think, a two-part series where we delve into the book of Romans, specifically looking at the chapters which unveil the purpose of the law at Sinai, because Paul is very, very clear on what the reason was for the Sinai covenant. I want to take a few steps back first before we go in there and just summarize what we've spoken of the past 2 days. Essentially, what we've explored is the fact that the Father's intention was always to fulfill the destiny which He had placed on Abraham and on his descendants by giving it to them as an act of grace, and that they would appropriate His promises through faith. In order for us to rely upon God in faith and to receive what He gives as grace, we need to believe that He is good. That's the foundational attitude of the heart that is necessary. That is called belief. However, we see a problem in the nation of Israel, and of course all of Scripture is there to instruct us. And so when we speak of Israel, we need to be asking the same questions of our own hearts. Israel had a fundamental quirk. They refused to believe in the goodness of God. They refused to believe that His intentions and His desires for them were good. This is called unbelief. Unbelief has got nothing to do with whether or not we believe God exists. Unbelief has to do with whether we believe that the God who does exist is a good God, or whether we believe that He is selfish and a miser. Israel, unfortunately, through their words and their actions, showed that they were convinced that God's ultimate plan was to kill them. They could not receive His grace by faith because fundamentally they had no faith in Him as a being. And so, because they could not trust in God's power, they only had their own strength to rely upon. Before they even came to Sinai, God had sworn an oath concerning them, and He said, they will never enter my rest. Their hearts keep going off track because of unbelief. And so when the covenant at Sinai was established, it was not a covenant of grace based on faith. It was a covenant custom designed for a people who were fundamentally taken up in unbelief. And since they could not receive God's grace, God's strength, God's power, it was designed to show them what a human being and what a race would need to do in order to realize God's vision for them. And I want to stop for one moment and say this. God's covenant of grace through faith has a vision for the human being, for the human micro community, and for the human macro community. He has a vision for the kind of people that we will become in Him on this earth, embodied in His covenant of grace. He said to Abram, through you, all nations will be blessed. God's vision for the human race in the covenant of grace and His vision for the human race in the covenant of the law of Sinai are the same. The difference is the means by which that vision is realized. In the covenant of grace, we believe God, we follow Him, we receive from Him, we operate not in order to earn His love, but from a place of being loved. And we, in our own capacity, in our micro communities, our families, our schools, our work, in our macro communities, our cities, our provinces and our nations, and indeed the whole earth, are then, by the power of God working in us, transformed into the people that He has in mind for this planet. When the Lord gave the law at Sinai, the vision was the same. Let's think of it as two paintings. On the right-hand side, you've got the covenant of grace. You have a painting, a masterpiece, painted by a master. Consider any painting that really appeals to you, and see that painting on the wall. This is the covenant of grace. This is what the Lord will create in us and through us as we follow Him in faith, as we believe in His goodness. He will create the masterpiece, His vision for humanity. But if we are going to be stubborn about matters and say, God, we can't trust you to do it. If we're going to rely on our own strength, then on the left-hand side, there is the same painting, but it is a paint by number. It's the master saying, listen, if you want to give this thing a crack in your own strength, try this. That's the Sinai covenant, a paint by number. The route that a human being, a human in micro community, a human in macro community would need to follow in order to achieve the same vision. But you know how it goes with paint by numbers, right? Even when they're done exceptionally well, they really don't look like the masterpiece. But our problem is so much deeper. Our problem is not that we're not yet master artists. Our problem is that we just really can't paint. Period. And this, it's spoiler alert, but that's one of the most profound purposes of the law. And let me maybe make a distinction. There's the vision of the law, and there's the purpose of the law. The vision of the law is to describe a human being living in relationship with God. Human beings living in relationship with God and with one another, and macro communities of countries, economies, and everything else living in relationship and in unity with God. That's the vision. The purpose of the Sinai covenant is very, very different. You see, when God gave that covenant at Sinai, He knew the end result. He knew also that it would take some time for us to come into agreement with Him. Because the end result of trying to achieve God's vision in our strength is always failure. Always. That's the spoiler alert, right? So let's climb into it. We're going to go to Romans chapter 2. Verse 17 to 29. Verse 17. In Romans 2, what Paul is doing is painting the black, dark, stormy backdrop for the magnificence of the gospel of grace. And he begins speaking about reprobate humanity, those who have drifted far from God Himself and who really have become totally unmoored from the life of God and are living nothing but licentious lives of indulgence and sin. And we come to see that portion of humanity, they're in deep need of saviors. He then addresses a second portion of humanity. It's the portion of humanity who do not know God personally via the Sinai covenant, but who through their actions show that they're living in harmony with their conscience. Their conscience being the genetic law of God that is encoded into the human being. And Paul highly commends such people. The pagans, he calls them, or the unbelievers who through their actions show that their hearts are actually turned towards God. But fundamentally, they still are knowing God from a distance and not close up. They're knowing God via the intermediary of their conscience. Now he comes to the third group of human beings, and he's presupposing that his audience are listening, perhaps if they are Jewish, with a bit of smug pride, because they're saying, well, we're not of the reprobates, nor are we of those good-hearted Gentiles who know God from a distance. We have the law, we have the prophets, we live in accordance with the law. Remember, he's painting the black backdrop against which the glory of the gospel of Jesus is going to be revealed. Now he begins to speak of the Jewish people, those who live in covenant with God, the Sinai covenant. Verse 17 of chapter 2, but if you call yourself a Jew and you rely upon the law and you boast of your relation to God and you know his will and approve what is excellent because you're instructed by the law, and if you are sure that you are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, then you who teach others, will you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples and so benefit from the income of idols? I put that in myself there. You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God by breaking the law? For here is what is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law. But if you break the law, your circumcision becomes uncircumcision. So if a man who is uncircumcised keeps the precepts of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as if it was circumcision? Then those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law, will condemn you who have the written code and circumcision but break the law. For he's not a real Jew, he's one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. He is a Jew who is one inwardly. And real circumcision is a matter of the heart, spiritual and not literal. His praise is not from men, but from God. I'm going to skip forward to chapter 3, verses 9 to 21. What then? Are we Jews any better off than the pagan and who lives by his conscience and the one who doesn't? I'm putting that in there. Not at all. For if I have already charged that all men, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin, as it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have gone wrong. No one does good, not even one. Their throat is an open grave. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. In their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks of those who are under the law. I'm going to pause there. In other words, that quotation that he's just made is not speaking about the unbeliever. It's speaking about those who are under the law. Those are excerpts from the prophets, and they're the conclusions of the prophets regarding the people of Israel. So that every mouth may be stopped, and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For no human being will be justified in God's sight by works of the law, since through the law comes the knowledge of sin. And this is the turning point of his introduction. But now, the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law. Although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, since, in parentheses I'm putting, as I've just shown, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are all justified by His grace as a gift through the redemption which is in Jesus Christ. What is the first purpose of the law that we see over here? Through the law comes the knowledge of sin. You see, the vision of the Sinai law was to show us how we could be the people, the people that God had envisaged for this earth. I suppose you could go person, people, and planet that God had in mind. That was the vision. But the actual purpose was that having given it everything, we would come to the conclusion that we have a problem that is far, far deeper than simply not knowing what the right thing to do is. Through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Paul fleshes this out far more deeply in the rest of this book. But this is the first purpose of the law, to help us to understand how far gone we are. Paul speaks of it later, but there's a law that's actually at work in us, and it's not the Sinai law, it's a different law called the law of sin and death. In our natural state, detached from the person of Jesus, there is a setting inside of us as human beings that takes the benchmark of God's law and uses it to go in exactly the opposite direction. The law was given. The Sinai law was given to the people of Israel so that ultimately they could come to the point where they said, we have depended upon our own strength and our own quote-unquote goodness for long enough. We've run aground so very many times. We have rebelled so consistently. We have come to the conclusion that our righteousness, as Paul himself said, is worth nothing more than a hill of garbage. We are in need of something else. Folk, I wanted to look at two passages today. This has been long enough. This might not be a two-part series. It might go into a few more. But this is the first purpose of the Sinai law. It was given so that we could come to understand how far gone we are. I want to conclude by saying the reason I'm wanting to look at this in such depth is because in my time as a follower of Jesus, I have run aground on not understanding this particular issue, and I've seen many sincere followers of Jesus run aground on the same issue. You see, it is not uncommon, especially when someone first comes back to Jesus with all their love and their enthusiasm and their desire to follow Him. It is almost guaranteed that we will in some way or another begin pursuing Him in the power of our own strength rather than following Him in the magnificence of His grace. I've seen it time and again, and there are vast portions of the church who do not understand this particular dynamic about the human soul. And so I grew up in a portion of the church. They did not follow the Mosaic law to the letter. So in other words, people didn't run around not trimming their beards and wearing tassels and looking like Jewish people. But they had their own little set of laws that were sacred. And if you followed those instructions, you were a good Christian. And if you didn't follow them, you were a bad Christian. And they included stuff like women had to wear dresses and men had to wear pants. They included things like ladies were not allowed to wear makeup and nail polish. They included things like you weren't allowed to smoke and you weren't allowed to drink. Laws, traditions of men, they weren't even from Sinai. But they were used as the standard of whether you were a good follower of Jesus or not. In our day, there are movements that are wanting to return to being like Jewish people. Now, there is so much richness. I kept Passover with my family this year. We had roast lamb on Passover. We made flat bread. And it was a beautiful and rich experience where I was able to teach my children so much about Passover and Jesus' death and resurrection. But going back in and trying to become adherents to the law, we're looking for salvation under a covenant that was actually designed to purely show us how badly we needed grace. We will speak again tomorrow, folks. But I'm speaking these things not for your condemnation. I'll close again with 3:21, Romans 3:21. But now, the righteousness of God has been manifest apart from law. Although the law and the prophets bear witness to it, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and they are all justified by His grace as a gift through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus. May His peace be your inheritance. May His joy be your daily bread today. And may you know the absolute marvelous experience of being surrounded by His wraparound grace. May God bless you.